a delight to be back at Leeds, albeit virtually, and albeit unable to see any of the other people. All I've got is ET, JSRM, etc. Maybe there'll be chance to do that once I get rid of the PowerPoint. It's good to be back. Leeds 16 years ago. As a pastoral theologian disguised as an applied ethicist, and for the last 16 years I've been an applied ethicist at Leeds Beckett. And please could you refrain from asking me why a university should have a title based upon a dodgy banker. I've been there, as I say, doing applied ethics, but all the while yearning to get back to practical theology, as distinct from pastoral. But now that I've retired, it's my chance to begin to reflect a little bit on practical theology and these areas of applied ethics and how they might come together. Why am I interested in the duty of candour? Because I've just finished a joint paper with a colleague at the Open University Law Department on public integrity and duty of candour. I've just finished a book on nursing and healthcare ethics, and duty of candour is a part of that, coming out in 2021. And I've been working with the police, West Yorkshire Police, and the Northern Region Code of Ethics Committee, and that whole area of policing is focusing a lot more on how to build a culture of truthfulness. So all of this is an area that interests me. But also, I've been interested in this because of working with Mervyn King over the last probably 8 years now. Mervyn King, not the world famous darts player, and not the former banker, but Nelson Mandela's favourite judge, who's developed over the past several decades 4 reports on governance. And these reports on governance are focused on relationships rather than regulation. More of that will emerge in the conversation. Can I just say, please, Caroline, do you have a bell or a hooter that can sound out, say 5 minutes before the end of 40 minutes?
Yeah, we can do. We can be reasonably flexible though, but yeah, absolutely. I can time it, and I can
go for it.
I can pipe up.
All right. Okay. Fine. Yeah. Excellent. Even better. So what I'm going to talk about today is number one, the issue of duty of candour, a brief history of why it's emerged and what the key elements of the debate are, and then to move into something like a reflection on that. I've used the term theological reflection, but that's a term which is up for debate in different ways. At the heart of that theological reflection will be an examination of the mid-staffs culture, the mid-staffs hospital trust, and moving on from there, I want to begin to talk about what a culture of change might look like and how it needs to be based on face-to-face relationships rather than regulation. How it basically, in terms of theology, should be based in the notion of agape, transcending sectional interests and moving into the hospital, but any organization, as a place of truthfulness. not simply a place where you share adverse incidents and the truth about them. Okay, let's move on rapidly. I'll get through the first 5 or 6 slides at pace. We know what Candour means when we know how Candour is very much associated with about the difficulty of being truthful in an adverse situation, in an embarrassing situation. The debate has been fascinating over the past couple of decades, and it's been focused in really the kinds of disasters which have hit the headlines: Hillsborough disaster, Mid-Staff's Hospital Trust scandal. From the Hillsborough panel, or independent panel, emerged this desire for a statutory duty of candour. How do we open things up, and especially if there are any adverse events? And so there emerged this public authority accountability bill, and for all kinds of reasons, as I note in the PowerPoint, that's never actually reached law. There are still those who want to argue that it should be brought into law. Meantime, of course, in healthcare, we have a parallel series of issues. Just look at those reports, look at those inquiries. That's an awful lot of inquiries over the past 2 decades. And you can add to that now all the issues about Shrewsbury and Telford maternity care. And you might get to wonder, I mean, how much money have we spent on reflecting on problematic cultures and the consequences of them, and how much have we learned from those kinds of inquiries? You can see there the kinds of things that they've been looking for, and again, duty of candour became an important element that many were arguing for. Then we see the Health and Social Care Act 2008. It creates a new regulatory body. This is the Care Quality Commission, to regulate the professions, and it emphasises the need for quality and organisational responsibility, but no mention of a statutory duty of candour. And so we reach that point where we are looking at no national health service organisation was in breach of any statutory regulation or law if it covered, and I can't see what I've written behind that because of this little, hang on, I'll just do that. No, anyway, if it's there was no regulation that will be a backstop for any adverse reactions. Now, the turning point occurs in the Francis report on the Mid-Staff's Hospital Crisis, 2013. You can see there, I'm sure most of you will know about that. Most academics in different disciplines have looked very carefully at this as an example of problems in governance, leadership, and ethics, and so on. And at the heart of that was this notion that there needed to be this statutory duty of candour, and then inevitably this emerges. Regulation section 2014 section 3. There is this duty, this statutory duty for providers from 2015 to open this up, and it has criminal sanctions. That sounds an awful lot, but in fact, what it means is that we're moving into a situation where they might get fined, and there's not an awful. There's not huge fines. It's more about the effect upon the reputation of the organisation. And now we have a threefold duty of candour. How interesting! So we have a professional duty of candour, certainly been there since the 1950s. And this being open and honest with patients if things go wrong. This acknowledges that both medical and nursing professions are focused in the same ethical duty. When it was reinforced by the General Medical Council and the Nursing and Midwifery Council in 2015. Joint guidance on the duty of candour, the professional duty of candour. And the focus of that, of course, is some kind of a covenant relationship with patients. Professionalism, or the professional is there to care for the patient, is there in their interests. And this is I call understanding of what it means to be a professional or professions. Okay, but also we have the contractual duty, and we have the statutory duty now. There are certain differences in the way in which each of these is expressed. But the important point is that both contractual duty and statutory duty are on the organisations to ensure that they practice this duty of candour. So again, it's a reinforcement, you might say, of the professional duty. As that is being developed, we have a number of elements in the debate which have been emerging over the past decade. First of all, the threefold duty of candour reflects the complex and ambiguous dynamics of healthcare. Professional body both has a covenant relationship with patients, but it also, as we all know, is very ambiguous, and there's a lot of work which looks at the way in which professions defend their power. Healthcare organisations have to both facilitate the delivery of healthcare, but also enable organisational sustainability. Hasn't got to go bankrupt. And the health service, which has to enable the delivery and to defend patients' rights. And we look at the NHS England Constitution there, which is a very interesting document. 2009, only emerged then. It's not a real constitution. It's a summary of the rights and responsibilities of patients and professionals. Now, some would argue that the statutory duty is an important backstop. It works against the self-interest of the professions and ensures that the organisations stay focused on patient relationships. Others argue that the way in which this is panning out shows a lack of zeal on the part of the CQC in applying a fundamental standard like the duty of candour. CQC replied by saying, actually, it's not important that we hit them all with fines. We need to be enabling learning, and so we want to be in dialogue rather than being overzealous. Debate continues with all kinds of questions now emerging about how difficult candour is. Risk to career, legal risk, difficulty of assessing harm, complexity about any situation, the impossibility of nil harm, risks to the organisation. Others want to argue rules and regulations are not the right way to develop what is at base of virtue. Similar debates emerged in the corporate governance field with the King reports 2009 and 2017, which led King to talk about the importance of regulation properly worked through what they call stakeholder dialogue, face-to-face regulation, not the kind of power approach to regulation, which in some way reinforces many of the problems which had been there before. It also leads to a danger of formulaic response. All are agreed that any duty is part of is only part of opening up the whole culture. And Francis has quite some time on trying to look at what that culture might be, and that's summed up on slide 8 there. I think the important series of questions that are now emerging are around slightly deeper issues than systemic control, very important. Regulatory control, very important in order to avoid certain practices. But there are certain questions now emerging about the underlying relationships. And I think that's where I would hope theology can begin to come in and contribute something to the debate. The kinds of things that are emerging in discussions are that yes, there was a danger of focusing on appearance, reputation, rather than honesty and reconciliation from the patient's and family's point of view. And this it begins to drill down to what's actually happening. I mean, one of the key elements of the statutory duty of candour is that there should be an honest and open apology for what happened. But once you're into apology and questions of forgiveness, you're into a very delicate relationship. The focus is on reconciliation, conflict resolution. And much of the evidence from Moore and Mello and Fob and Barclay suggests that we need to look at what the patients or the families want. Clear evidence of learning from the professional bodies, the organisation. Clear evidence that their voice has been heard. And what the experience and the impact has been on patient and family, and acknowledged. Greater dialogue. It's not just making sure that you have everything recorded. It's not just making sure that you have ticked the box of apology and so forth. It's something about, do they really mean it? It's something about an underlying relationship that that these writers suggest is important to be focused on. This takes us into a world of relationship. Now, theological reflection. As I said at the beginning, the notion of theological reflection is up for debate. What I want to suggest is that A, it needs to be an honest and open reflection on the underlying relationships of any situation, and B, that we can then move into some kind of conversation about the theological elements of this. Please, I'm not suggesting that there is any theological perspective which is totally different from others, but this will emerge shortly. So, important for me in this is to note that within the mid-staff's case, and I'll focus on that as the particular example. We have a number of things. Questions about justice. We have questions about relationships. The justice issues, is it about retribution? Is it about restorative justice? The relationship issues is reconciliation, but what about power? Questions about learning. How does an organization learn? There's a lot. Sengi and others want to talk about the learning organization. Well, what does that actually mean? And there are questions about truth. How do you develop a truthful organization? How does an organization become a place of truth? Now, it's very clear, number one, that the mid-staff's case demonstrated an organization which was not, it was focused in conflict. It was not at peace with itself. Secondly, it was not a place of justice. Thirdly, it wasn't a place of truth. Clearly wasn't a place of truth. And it certainly wasn't a place of shared responsibility, where people were able to see possibilities in the future, the development of an imaginative approach to care. On the contrary, it was about defensiveness, and you can see that in the list on PowerPoint 9. There's a whole number of different conflictual relationships emerging. One was the whole question of organizational sustainability and core purpose of care, so the R&C versus management. And actually, we're moving into a genuine question of who is my colleague? Who is my colleague? Or is my colleague in another profession actually the enemy? Are they actually seeking to undermine our position in this situation? Not a straightforward, absolutely not a straightforward polarized position, not least because both sides in that believed that they were practicing integrity. Both of them could come out with a number of different principles about healthcare, or the nature of care, about the distribution of care, about the just distribution of care. Both could be working on that, but no conversation, no dialogue about how all of those values come together, and a genuine enmity. Secondly, that basic polarization was exacerbated by the focus on metrics and by the government's approach. We'll come back to that later. But what this then leads to is a whole number of things. Hyper accountability, and it's a one-way accountability. Isomorphism, all things have to be done in the same way. Patient as consumer, we have to defend the patient. I want to argue that Francis lets the government off in his report. He is critical of their changes of policy over time, and how that wrong foots professional practice and organizational practice. But it's quite clear there's a number of factors in the way in which the government over the past 20 years has approached healthcare that actually exacerbates the divide. Again, we can discuss that later. Then we see the divide between patients and families who raised issues. They were perceived as a threat to organizational success. An extraordinary way in which they were sidelined. They were the enemy. They were not the neighbor. They were patients also, and their needs were not perceived. There was no perception, leading to a denial of responsibility. These were akin to the invisible poor. It's an extraordinary thought, and I think we have to keep remembering that a lot of nursing staff were shocked that this could have happened. That they could walk past people in need, people who were dying in corridors, people who were dying of dehydration. Extraordinary lack of awareness. There was also breakdown within professions. Some nursing and middle-level leadership dismissing the questions from junior nurses and doctors, applying pressure on colleagues. Forget about that issue. I'll deal with that. Go away and do what you have to do. Nursing whistleblowers seen as traitors. Division exacerbated by local community abuse of whistleblowers seen as a threat. The whistleblowers were seen as a threat to the local healthcare provisions. They didn't want this to lead to the government withdrawing their services in some way locally. And on top of all that, organisations, i.e. regulators outside the particular healthcare trust, several could see issues that were problematic, but they did not take that responsibility seriously for following that through until the whistleblowing became a little louder. Okay, as I've said, it's actually a really interesting, complex situation. It's not a straightforward notion. And in the midst of all that, responsibility was fractured, no sense of shared responsibility for core purpose, lack of mutual accountability, lack of a shared positive responsibility for action. And hence there was most parties denied responsibility, focused in fear of blame, failure. There was no sense in which either the organization or indeed the government framework for the organization was able to articulate any notion of how we deal with professional failure, not just in terms of reporting, but how the professional deals with that failure. Questions there, not just about reconciliation with patients, but actually something about reconciliation with fellow professionals, reconciliation with yourself as a professional. There are several cases of questions of shame and how the shame emerges and how that's dealt with by, or not dealt with by, the professional in this situation. Power imposed, not shared. Actions were determined. There was no freedom there, no autonomy, no professional autonomy, and this was forcing truth-telling to power into a conflictual stance. There was no much of truth-telling was about telling the truth that was thought to be required in terms of hitting certain targets, and this led to, in certain situations, false reporting. So organizational defensiveness is not straightforward. It really is about relationships. It really is about looking behind the system to see how we can begin to engage those relationships more openly and more securely. So yeah, okay, let's get real. One of the critical points, it seems to me, of a theological response to this is focused in agape, and there's a long tradition of this, but the key to agape is both the unconditional presence of the other, focused eventually in God, and always being there for the person, the commitment to the other person, regardless of contract. It's a covenantal position, but also the impetus within that for self-reflection, for critical self-reflection on one's identity. In this case, one's identity as a professional, complex identity, of course. But also the third impulse is the impulse to action, to respond. This is about praxis. It's not about a nice philosophical, theological concept. It's how do we respond, and how are the possibilities enabled, which brings us to a whole bunch of things about imagination and how the imagination, moral and otherwise, can be engaged. Forgive that brief summary there, but I want to point you to a very old tradition there with Wilson, Campbell, and May. Obviously, there are a whole bunch of other traditions behind that theologically. I want to point you to new, interesting, practical approaches to this emerging from other fields. Fawkes in 2014, a remarkable book, argues for the importance of professional bodies practicing critical reflection on the shadow side of the organization. Joanna in that book, believe it or not, is reflecting on the PR profession, which nobody thinks, well, forgive me, often is not thought to be a place of truth, but it's really critically important, she argues, that all professions and by extension organizations within which they work focus on the shadow side, the side that they do not normally focus on. It needn't be the bad side, it's the shadow side. And of course then moving into a whole bunch of other areas, that shadow side it's fascinating. I just want to point to two examples of the way in which our view of our identity in organizations like healthcare, even like higher education, is often flawed. Gregory and Willis in 2013, they worked with some healthcare boards. And they did a values audit with those boards. The basic first question was, do you know what the values of your organization are? Yes, they cried. And after a conversation, they confirmed. The next question was, can you name a deliberation and practice that came from that in the past 12 months, which in any way reflected on those core values? And in all three boards that they worked with, they couldn't tie that up. They couldn't. Why? A, because they hadn't thought about how they deliberate. B, because values on the whole were treated as trophies. These are important things. They are shining examples of what we must be thinking about. And yet they were placed in the cabinets, not part of their ongoing decision-making, deliberation, and their governance practice. Another example of the way in which, but mark you, that they believed that they were focusing in their practice on those values. McNamara, 2015, who talks about the architecture of listening in organizations. He worked with leadership across a number of different organizations, and to a man, and it was usually a man, forgive me, to a man, the leaders thought they were dialogic. When he asked if he could examine this, he discovered that 80% of their communication was one way. And the other 20% was instrumental. How will we solve this problem? Give us a hand, whatever. The important point is that we're looking at a lack of reflection upon one's identity in practice. Now, there's a whole depth there. And of course, we might be talking partially about phronesis. But I want to argue it's a bit deeper than simply looking at purpose. There's something underlying there which is about our very being, and about therefore our identity. But it's also something about how we see others and the identity of others. I worked with Murdoch University in Australia last year in a couple of sessions where we were looking at the different parts of the university. And I invited them to talk about their values, and it was astonishing how the administrators within the university and the those working in healthcare faculties and other areas began to see that the other group had values that they hadn't expected. They hadn't expected to see values which were so interesting, and indeed so close to their own. They hadn't had that conversation. The foundation I'm suggesting that this kind of reflection is on ontology. It's about being. It's about empowering. It's about what in nursing has been referred to as presencing, the presence which empowers the other. And this is the core dynamic for learning focused in articulation of narrative, enabling epistemic distance, enabling handling the feelings as well as the ideas, as well as the concepts, as well as the practice in that kind of reflection. And it's central to the practice of responsibility. But then that's pretty obvious. Yeah, I want to argue that there's an agapeic basis to this. Truthfulness in this takes on a very different hue from the notion of a risk-focused regulation about sharing of adverse information. And even just that involves reflection on identity and value. There's a lot of conversation that could be had about truthfulness here, Aristotle's aletheia, and how truthfulness relates to critical dialogue and to integrity. Cottingham has a very interesting paper on that notion of integrity as struggle, constant reflection, critical reflection on who I am, and how I want to project that. Fawkes would talk about reflection on your persona, and how one might deal with that. But how can all this be? How can we be bringing this kind of reflection? What's the reality here? We don't have time for that, surely. Moore in Business Ethics talks about. He's a great one for virtues. Talks about management techniques as crowding out the virtues. And in this context, truthfulness, in the way that I've been talking about it, based on who we are, face to face. Accountability is not just a written account; it's an account face to face. And this kind of truthfulness it can be seen by some people as principal management thinkers as telepathic, taking the eye off the key outcomes for success. However, without some kind of focus on this, there is no doubt that Moore is, well, I would argue, is right, that the stress on single purposes and on isomorphic practice disables the practice of professional judgment. In other words, that by not bringing in this kind of openness, this kind of reflection, this focus on relationships, we get less done. We have less trust. We have less focus on the core issues, and ultimately that goes into the work of people like Chia, and indeed work on work on the political side, where there have been a number of writers who focused on the way in which the government has focused on saving money. It's called the Whitehall effect, but actually ends up in taking its eye off the core notion of care, of the core purpose of the healthcare organization. Okay,
Simon, you've got about 5 minutes.
Well, that's brilliant. Okay, so I will summarize. I will summarize the practical elements that I want to argue for here. One is that we need to focus in on virtues. Agape connects to virtues. Thomistic approach behind this, and I want to argue a good example of that is the way in which agape relates to empathy. Empathy per se is not something which wishes the good of the other. And we only need to look at the example of Iago, who is in some respects the most empathic character within Othello. There's a lot of work around that. Empathy needs more than simply awareness of the situation and of others and of their feelings and so forth and so on. Secondly, this virtuous side, there's already lots of work there. It just needs to be a greater dialogue with other people who are doing that work around reflective practice, around notions of formation. Weston, in his eco-leadership approach, argues that leaders have to be formed. He argues akin to Buddhist monks. Wow. But it's a formation of the person, not simply the collection of a number of different skills. And those skills connect to a core notion of commitment to the other. And I want to ask, do we take virtue seriously in learning and training? Barnett and Maxwell asked this about higher education. I don't think, I want to say we don't. It took me three years to get the notion of phronesis into a particular course that I ran. And one of the issues, I think, is that we don't take seriously any of the skills outcomes in teaching and learning. Forgive me, that's a slightly naughty assertion, but I'm happy to argue or discuss that. So a pedagogy on virtue. Carr has been thinking about that for some time. How do we develop the virtues? Not just moral virtues, but psychological virtues. And Aquinas, I think, clearly sees the connection. Intellectual virtues and psychological virtues and others. Secondly, we can focus on the governance and culture of an organization like a hospital as a place of truth, a culture of critical reflection. It can be done. There's lots of work around this. Again, look at 2009 King, the third King report. His focus on culture begins with how do we get the ethical character of the organization developed. It begins with that, and this is his whole approach. Globally is a formidable piece of work, which is working very much against other approaches to governance, both in terms of regulatory approaches and others which have a different approach. The notion there is a dwelling place which can begin to enable all to dwell within it. Is there such a thing that can enable, is there such a focus that can enable people to have that sense of being together in the National Health Service? NHS Constitution, perhaps, but only founded in 2009. It does not actually look at the history. It is not a point of memory about how tradition in care has evolved. There isn't that ontological sense of commitment over time to something which is very special. Yes, the NHS belongs to the people, but what does that mean in terms of the narrative of the NHS over time? Again, I think this says that the culture of truth is something that the government has to be involved with, but we have to be involved in at all levels. There's a difference. That's fine. Embodying that meaning, rituals within organisations, annual meetings have tended to be within organisations a place where you rehearse the conversation. And where you limit the conversation and where you disempower people who are part of the annual meeting, other than those who speak a certain vocabulary, principally accountancy. There's a whole bunch of questions there which I'm happy to explore. But it's quite clear that annual meetings can become something much bigger. annual weekends in which there is a celebration of how we relate to the local community, of how an organization relates to the different groups within the organization, of how the tradition can be developed in terms of the ongoing narrative. A place of imagination as well, a critical element within this notion of a covenant community. Final example, interagency practice, and I just leave you that to look at later. This is a remarkable example, the Amsterdam Healthy Weight Program, interagency work at its very best. The most recent figures I've seen are that they have reduced childhood obesity in their area, especially in the poor areas, by 13%. Things also going on here in Leeds, parallel things, really important to think about. And they, well, it's just a remarkable example of the way in which a learning interagency experience enables parents, schools, businesses, local government, universities to reflect on their own identity and what they are contributing to this, and not just the public good, but upon the very nature of their local community. Parents in particular, the way in which they were enabled to develop responsibility for their core tasks, developing the skills and virtues for getting their children to bed, because sleep is one of the critical elements for weight loss, for controlling sleep, weight. But many of the parents testified that they didn't know how to do it, and this in itself was leading to the sense of disempowerment for them. So how do we empower them? Focus in a remarkable discipline, and the discipline was to each other. It wasn't an overall thing saying you must do this. It wasn't regulatory in that sense. And fascinatingly, they said, as we develop our imaginative response to this, the last thing we will do is to ask for specific government money. First, we see what we can do together, and then, when the focus is more clear, then we might ask for money. It's a great notion. Okay, now that's the raw notion, and the takeaways for this for me are that we need to move into much bigger conversations into the public square, across disciplines, across organizations, and the government needs to be part of this. It is a critical part, because it seems to me that the government isn't owning any of this kind of reflection. Final piece of personal memory. Probably 10 years ago, I was at a conference in Cambridge, speaking alongside Andrew Lansley, who was then the Secretary for Healthcare. And he was about to reveal all the extraordinary changes that he wanted to have in terms of the healthcare. And I said to him that David Jenkins, he of hallowed memory of Leeds, David Jenkins had referred to the National Health Service as a sack of care. And then said to him, can you tell us what kind of philosophy underlies your approaches to healthcare? And Andrew, bless him, said, we wouldn't use that kind of language. There was no reflection on this deep understanding, call it a philosophy, call it a worldview, call it a belief about core importance. No reflection on care and the meaning of care. His focus was entirely about how do I best deliver something which I can measure in a particular way. Now, of course, Andrews didn't work, but it's still the notion that we can deliver and achieve certain successes is still there. and it still, I want to argue, takes away from the underlying question of candour and truthfulness, and being truthful about who we are, and therefore about how we see failure, and therefore about our limitations. And again, I think that's one of the key problems in terms of politics. Theology has to be part of that. It has to be part of that public square. And I raise the challenge: how can we be part of that in Leeds and in the Leeds area?